Good evening, I'm Raina Edgar, Director of Education and Programs for the Arkansas Arts Center. And on behalf of our staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us this evening for 5 Women Artists You Should Know with Melissa Messina. Melissa is a nationally recognized arts professional who has developed thought-provoking exhibitions, dynamic site-responsive projects, and engaging educational programming, both independently and in leadership positions at museums and nonprofits. For over 15 years, her work with regional, national, and international artists have been presented in the US, in Atlanta, Kansas City, Miami, New York, New Orleans, Richmond, Savannah, and Washington, D.C., as well as in Bermuda, France, and Hong Kong. She has lectured extensively, published widely, and her research on Black female abstract practitioners has been funded by the Creative Time Warhol Foundation, the Stuart A. Rose Library at Emory University, and the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. In 2017, she co-created Magnetic Fields, Expanding American Abstraction, 1960s to Today, an intergenerational exhibition highlighting 21 Black female abstract practitioners that traveled from the Kemper Museum of Contemporary Art in Kansas City to the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., and the Museum of Fine Arts, St. Petersburg, Florida. She recently co-curated Mildred Thompson, The Atlanta Years, 1986 to 2003, at Spelman College Museum of Fine Art in Atlanta, Georgia, and Mildred Thompson Against the Grain at the New Orleans Museum of Art. In addition to serving select public and private clients, she is the curator of the Mildred Thompson Estate. Welcome, Melissa.
Raina, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Arkansas Art Center, for having me. It really is a delight to be back with you. I think it was a few years ago we did a program, so it's exciting to be back. So would you like me to just dive right into the presentation? And then it sounds like maybe you received some questions from your community that we can answer at the end?
Yeah, that would be great.
Perfect, perfect, excellent. Well, again, thank you for having me. This is an exciting opportunity to share 5 Black female abstract artists with you. In some ways, I feel like the title of this talk could be 5 women mark makers you should know, or 5 women painters you should know, because there is a specificity to their practice that is rooted in mark making and primarily in painting, although many of them have taken on many other media. But my research, and I'd like to give a quick little shout out to the Crystal Bridges Museum. I was a Tyson Fellow last year at this time, and I was really able to kind of hone this research in a little bit. And so I'm excited to share some of these artists with you today. I have selected 5 Black women working within the language of abstraction who were all born within 6 years of one another. Mildred Thompson was born in 1936, the eldest of the 5, and Howardena Pindell, born in 1942, is the youngest. And each one of them had or has an incredibly dedicated practice that champions and expands the language of American abstraction. Each one of them, and I don't mean to homogenize their experience, they're all quite different women with the impetus behind their work being quite different, but there are certain similarities in that it is a generation of women who were all, as I said, very dedicated to their practice, educated, pursued exhibitions, pursued collections, pursued this very intense investigation into a personal expression that was using what they felt and feel is more of a universal language, and that is abstraction. And I'll be really blunt. I mean, the title of this is 5 Women Artists You Should Know, and so the implication is, why don't you know them? And the answer is simply 2 things. It's racism and sexism. And so I want to kind of give this presentation to not only talk about each one of them, albeit however briefly as I can in, a half an hour or so, try to, kind of encapsulate their work and give a little taste of what it is they're doing, in the hopes that you as the audience will take the time to investigate them further. But what is implied is, again, why you don't know them. And so I like to kind of often start with a quote by Lowry Stokes Sims that really encapsulates this notion that my friend and colleague Dina Muller beautifully described as we were talking about this years ago, that these women were working in a periphery of a periphery of a periphery. Lowry says African-American female artists who work in abstract styles continue to struggle for recognition, facing resistance from certain camps of Black self-image making, which perceive abstraction as being outside an authentic Black identity. And so these women were first and foremost female, and so certainly they're not going to get the same recognition that male artists get. That's just a sad fact. They're Black women, and then they've also chosen this language that is very sort of mythologized as a white, sort of macho American expression, certainly rooted in a Eurocentric tradition, but was really packaged in the late 40s and 50s, and is still considered today this very kind of white male language. And yet they have chosen not only to pursue it, but to adapt it, expand it, push it beyond anything that its originators could have possibly imagined. And so again, where this research comes from and where these 5 artists are selected from is an exhibition, thank you, Raina, for mentioning it, that Erin Jedgetts and I curated in 2017 that really did look at, it was very much an introduction, by no means comprehensive, but really tried to celebrate Black women working within this language of abstraction and to show its legacy and how the boundaries of this expression had been pushed and is being pushed. And so it was clear as we were doing our research, we actually thought that an exhibition like this must have already been done. And when we determined that it hadn't been, we kind of looked at each other and said, why not us? Let's investigate this. Let's put a group of advisors together. Let's talk with artists. Let's dig into why we don't know more about this really important aspect of American history. And it was really obvious to us that exhibitions, collections, historical texts, I mean, women of color working in this way were completely omitted, footnoted, and at the very best undervalued. And so when I think about Mildred Thompson, who was my professor and mentor and whose example I'm guided by every day of my life, I always look to kind of this quote by her. And again, this isn't to try to paint with too broad a brush. Each women come to their practice with very, very different, again, kind of impetus and inspiration, but in an overarching way, Mildred, like the other 4 artists, really felt like abstraction was a universal language that they could personalize. Mildred said there are symbolic things that have to be learned to make work universal. You can't limit who you communicate with, but first you have to know yourself. And she notes that everything she touches is Black and female, and that her success is certainly part of that. So again, it's an artist like these others who privileged abstraction over a more overt, figurative or narrative-based media, which or form of expression, which has primarily been and continues to primarily be the mode of expression for African-American artists and most artists. And so the biography, while each woman is certainly proud and, kind of considering themselves women of the world, global practitioners, understanding that they are making a contribution to the history of American art, the work isn't biographical in an overt kind of literal way. Certainly biography plays a role, and again, to different extents in each artist's work. And so I want to start, and certainly I can't spend any really significant amount of time going into the biographies of each of these 5 artists. I truly hope everyone will be intrigued by this work and do some research on their own. But Mildred Thompson was born in 1936 in Jacksonville, Florida. She died in Atlanta in 2003. She attended Howard, like many of the artists in this presentation, as well as Skowhegan. And again, these are examples of you know, the reason you don't know these artists is not for their lack of trying, right? They educated themselves, they moved around the globe. Mildred lived and worked in Germany and in France for most of her adult life, kind of bounced back and forth between DC and Tampa in kind of the late 70s and into the 80s, and received an artist in residence at Spelman College, which brought her to Atlanta. And while there, she was teaching, like all of the other artists in this presentation, taught, each are incredibly dedicated educators, but also that role was out of necessity, because certainly they weren't, making a living off of selling their art. But anyway, to just note that these, artists are certainly held in collections, exhibited as much as they could, and have these very kind of dedicated careers. And so for each artist, I've tried to choose 2 works to exemplify a little bit of their practice, kind of maybe an older work and sort of a newer work, again, just as a teaser. And I do have some other slides for recent exhibitions that will hopefully show a little bit more of their practice. But this is a wood picture of Mildred Thompson's from the late 60s, made out of found wood and acrylic paint. And she really made a number of these over the course of her life, thinking about these wood segments as almost as if they were brushstrokes, as if they were, kind of segments in her painting. And over the years, that the segments that she was making with the found wood turned into brushstrokes. And like many women in this presentation, she moved through media, really picking the media that she felt best fit the idea that she was exploring. And so wood, kind of was this metaphorical material for her, thinking about nature and time, and certainly the idea of nature and time, as well as science and mathematics, particularly physics, music, were certainly very inspirational to Mildred Thompson in her lifetime. And this is a later work, a kind of master work from her Music of the Spheres series, where she's interpreting the cosmos. This is Mercury, very, very large scale painting. Mildred understood color. She created these atmospheres that were vibratory, that you sort of moved in and out of. And many of these artists kind of treat the painting support the canvas in that way to create large scale atmospheres. Betty Blayton was born in 1937 in Virginia, and she died in 2016 in the Bronx. She's probably best known as an arts administrator and arts educator. She was a co-founder of the Studio Museum in Harlem, as well as the Children's Art Carnival in Harlem, where she wrote arts education curriculum pretty much for the city of New York. It's kind of hard to fathom that it didn't really exist before Betty. But again, studied at Syracuse University, is a printmaker as well, like Mildred, working with Robert Blackburn, has works in a number of high-profile collections, and was featured in a documentary with 4 other artists of her generation. So again, I'm being very, very brief, but just trying to encapsulate a little bit of these artists' lives and some of their work. Betty is very well known for her tondo, kind of circular shaped paintings. And I think it, similarly to Mildred, although certainly more as a kind of religious practice, I use that word a little loosely, a spiritual practice, Betty came to abstraction thinking about kind of metaphysical ideas, right? How to express her feelings and her emotions in in a transcendental way, kind of using aqueous colors and forms and certainly the shape of her canvas to portray these expressions. This is a piece from 1970 and another work from 2007. And you'll see that there is a slight reference to the body. If you look, it's quite veiled in these kind of aqueous layers of color and mark. And for each artist, the sort of figure does find its way in and out of the work, although again, not in an overtly kind of representational way. It's sort of hinted at and layered over with shapes and colors and forms. Mary Lovelace O'Neal. I hope she doesn't mind that I included this image that I took of her in her studio a couple years ago. It's one of my favorites. She also attended Howard University and has a master's from Columbia, attended Skowhegan, has traveled the world, has exhibited widely, very recently had a solo show at Mnuchin Gallery in New York, kind of a big major survey exhibition that has a gorgeous monograph, and I'll show that in a minute. But again, another highly accomplished, dedicated artist, born in 1942 in Jacksonville, Mississippi, and lives and works currently in Oakland, California. This is an older work from the early 70s where Mary was really exploring notions of flatness. When you think about New York in the 70s, it was this time of sort of minimalist anti-expression, if you will. And she was exploring that and moving through it and kind of seeing what of that really applied to her. And certainly you see a beautiful mark making, and she talks about these sort of they're often described akin to a Barnett Newman zip, but in this case, they're really much more expressive, and they're sort of these channels into layers of color that she feels are sort of hidden behind this lamp black surface. And lamp black is almost like a charcoal, it's a powdered pigment, and she was brushing, using an eraser to brush this pigment into the surface, and they're unstretched canvases, so there's kind of another layer of flatness there. But you'll see as the work progresses that the gesture that is hinted at in those beautiful lines and marks become more expressive and become more lyrical, and the planes that are flattened in the earlier work sort of expand out. She talks about shifting planes. And you see more connections to architecture, and the work certainly is incredibly expressive in explosive color and gestural mark making. This is a piece running with my black panthers and white doves that was inspired by travel. All of these artists traveled the world and very much taking in the world around them. This piece also connects to Mary's activism. Certainly Black Panther is connected to her activist work. And it is also connected to memories of her father. And so these personal expressions, again, these women are choosing abstraction to express themselves, but understanding that there is a level of interpretation that is brought by the viewer. And so if you didn't know Mary's history, if you didn't know this was connected to a memory of her father, you're reading your own kind of experiences and taking your own perception and perspective to the work. And that's certainly something each artist has chosen abstraction for. Sylvia Snowden, I hope she also isn't angry with me for including this image that I took of her in her studio. Gosh, I think it was only a year ago. We're in such a time warp. Sylvia was born in 1942 in Raleigh and currently lives and works in Washington, D.C. Another graduate of Howard, of Skowhegan, studied in France, taught at a number of high-profile schools, has exhibited widely, has had solo shows around Washington, D.C. at the Phillips Collection, at the Katzen Museum, etc. So again, another highly, highly accomplished, despite the discrimination that she and others have faced. I selected this image, which is owned by the painting. It's owned by the National Gallery of Art, because it is maybe the most figurative that I've seen of Sylvia's. Sylvia probably pushes the figure out more than many, or arguably more than the other four artists, but you can see her incredible use of paint, the kind of passion and emotion and kind of viscerality of the way she handles paint is just a tour de force. A couple of more recent paintings from 2015, these were shown in that exhibition at the Katzen at American University. This is from her Cannes series. And again, this very textural, impastoed paint. She still won't tell me how she does it. There's kind of an immediacy to her work that is deceptive. There are so many layers. These paintings weigh so much. But the way she layers paint, you don't see brush strokes. They aren't poured. Again, she's kind of creating her own methodologies, and that turns into a very, very distinct expression. And last but not least in this presentation, certainly, Howardena Pindell, born in 1943 in Philadelphia and lives and works in New York. She, of course, highly educated, went to Yale, has taught for many years. Her work is included in major museums. There was a beautiful, beautiful retrospective curated by two of the smartest curators there is, Valerie Cassell-Oliver and Naomi Beckwith. And I think, in some ways, Howardena has received the most sort of recognition and success as of late out of the five. And there's certainly kind of hope to come for the others, things on the horizon. But an artist who is very celebrated for these sort of more subtle works, right? They're quite hard to document, but she has championed maybe a quieter, if you will, language of abstraction. They're sort of pointillistic, they're meditative, but she is known for producing these small hole punches, these little paper chads that are either adhered to the painting, or in some cases, they're it's the absence of the chad. It's kind of painted in a way that becomes shadowed, and they feel like textiles, and the texture is really, again, quite subtle. You feel like you're seeing a texture that is physical, and yet it's done in these kind of very light layers. Large scale works. This is a piece from 1970. And then she's also known for her shaped canvases. And this is a piece from 82 that's based on a series from her travels in Japan. I always think of Howardena's work as sort of marking time. And she was in an accident and had a head injury, and it's affected her memory. And these pieces are, they're kind of hard to see, but they're images of postcards and photographs from her travel. It's kind of this, they speak to memory and marking time in a way that's kind of piecing those memories together. Again, more quiet and meditative, but certainly looking at the essence of form. Similar in some ways to Mildred Thompson. They kind of particulate down to this kind of subatomic level where they feel kind of cosmic as well, and relating to a landscape of an abstract style. So again, I don't know that I did any justice to those five women. I could talk about each of them for longer than 45 minutes, but in the interest of time, kind of moving on, wanted to show some more examples of their work through the exhibition Magnetic Fields, Expanding American Abstraction. And I've selected some slides that really highlight the five of them. This is Mildred Thompson's Magnetic Fields in the very center of the slide. That was certainly the impetus for the title of the show. And there's a Howardena Pindell all the way to the right, the kind of shaped circular canvas. Betty Blayton to the left and Howardena Pindell to the right. And as the show traveled, the the way the works were laid out changed, and so the conversations between the works changed. And I will say this was an intergenerational exhibition. Alma Thomas was born in 1891, the oldest artist in the show, and the youngest being Abigail DeVille, born in 1981. So there were 21 artists who were championing this kind of non-representational, if you will, kind of formalist modes of abstraction. And yet, you know, the conversations between generations, between styles, between media were certainly something that Erin and I enjoyed seeing in each iteration of the show. This is a Mary Lovelace O'Neal on the left, and I will note Brenna Youngblood is the painting, the blue painting, and a Shanique Smith Bale on the right. Mary Lovelace O'Neal drawings, lamp black drawings, in conversation with Mildred Thompson on the right. That's a Maren Hessinger in the middle. And of course, a Sylvia Snowden, front and center. Again, that sort of visceral nature of her work, you just fall right into that painting. It's exquisite. Another iteration at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in DC, certainly, of course, the Betty Blayton on the left, and Howardena on the right, Sylvia on the left. And she's paired, it's sort of an unusual pairing. We had these dark walls that we were dealing with, and we put a small Mildred Thompson next to the Sylvia Snowden, which was a pairing that we did not expect. Barbara Chase Rabu is all the way to the right as another artist who I could have certainly included in this presentation. She's of the same generation. Betty Blayton's on the left. These are monoprints. I will say, again, working across media, I think each one of these women, yes, each one of these women were prolific printmakers as well, and expert printmakers. And at last, Mildred Thompson in the back with the names of each of the artists. And so to contextualize the show, when we were conceiving of the exhibition, it was a time where Black male abstract practitioners were sort of being rediscovered, which is a terrible, terrible word that people use because the artists have been making work all of this time. They have been how Valerie Cassell Oliver described as hiding in plain sight. So this notion of discovery has a very kind of colonialist message. So I use that in quotes, but certainly there was a resurgence of interest in examining the abstraction made by Black male artists. And someone like Romare Bearden, who's certainly known for his more figurative collages, had been making these incredible abstractions during the course of his life. And there was a beautiful show at DC Moore exemplifying that fact. Jack Whitten, long overdue retrospective exhibition and catalog that traveled. Certainly the market for his work, sales were on the rise, and receiving more wide recognition for his contribution to American abstraction. Sam Gilliam is probably, I would argue, maybe the best known artist, Black male artist working in abstraction, known for these draped canvases. Al Loving, again, this sort of resurgence, kind of a refocus on looking at American abstraction and honoring long overdue, much deserved contributions by Black male artists, but certainly women were being left out of this conversation. And so what Erin and I hoped to do with Magnetic Fields, again, was to sort of wave a flag. It was a signal to say, hey, there were a number of incredible women artists who were working sometimes alongside these men. I don't mean like sometimes in physical proximity, but in the same cities at the same time, in dialogue with one another, knew one another. And the work is as good, sometimes better, if I may, put my own personal projection, but certainly as good, as considered, as dynamic they were as dedicated, and so they are as deserving of the same recognition. And again, there are hopeful signs. Howardena Pindell's retrospective being an incredible step forward, because, you know, I am always of the mind that the high tide rises all boats. And so as people are looking at Howardena, my hope is that they were also saying, well, wait a minute, she was probably not the only Black female artist working in this way or in these ways during her lifetime, and certainly she was not. I will just hats off to Gallery Lalong, who has taken on Mildred Thompson's estate just with so much care and strategy and compassion and dedication. And this was Mildred Thompson's first solo exhibition in New York in Gallery Lalong in 2018. And we highlighted her radiation exploration paintings from the mid-90s, as well as works from the Magnetic Field series, which you saw, the kind of large yellow painting that was in the Magnetic Field show. Team Thompson, it takes a village. It is about all of us as curators and historians and critics and gallerists who come together to champion these incredible artists. And I'm very lucky to have a group of primarily women behind me on some of these endeavors. Including Andrea Barnwell, with whom I co-curated Mildred Thompson, the Atlanta years at Spelman, which honored her return to the United States in 1986 and really showcased some ephemera and highlighted the last decades of her life. These are slides from the Howardena Pindell retrospective that I've been mentioning at the MCA Chicago. Just stunning installation, brilliantly curated. The catalog is to die for. And I can't believe this happened this year. We were able to sneak in the Mnuchin Gallery solo show for Mary Lovelace O'Neal right before COVID hit. This was literally in February of 2019. And it was a stunning exhibition in a beautiful exhibition space. It was phenomenal to get to see a handful of works from each decade of Mary Lovelace O'Neal's expansive and dynamic practice. And Betty Blayton had a small but mighty show at Elizabeth D. Gallery in New York right after her passing. And it was organized as part of the Uptown Triennial at Columbia University. And again, it was a small space, but it really honored her work. And there was some ephemera. This is a picture, Betty is the second to the right, of the opening night at Studio Museum in Harlem in 1968. And certainly more on the horizon for Betty. Excited that out of the Magnetic Fields exhibition, the Virginia Museum of Fine Art purchased Consume #2, which, as you have seen, was really a showstopper in Magnetic Fields. And so happy to see that not only purchased, but on view and hung beautifully in context with other artists. Sylvia Snowden was celebrated at the Katzen Museum at American University in 2016 with a solo exhibition. And a beautiful brochure with some incredible writing. Of course, you know, you need to have these publications to last beyond the exhibition so that scholars can, and that even the general public can learn more about the work after the show closes. And here are 3 magnificent books: the Mary Lovelace O'Neal catalog from the Mnuchin show, the Mildred Thompson exhibition that Gallery Lalong produced for the solo show there, and Howardena Pindell's retrospective tome. It's just, you can dive right into it and lose yourself for days. And this is just, I don't mean to presume that the New York Times is the be all end all, but just to show that there have been, you know, art news, art forum, that, you know, there are publications that are reviewing these shows, that are paying attention to this resurgence. Certainly having your show reviewed in the New York Times brings this to a broader audience. And so I hope we're doing okay on time. I wanted to just take a moment, and I will move through these very quickly, and I know there's questions to ask, but to say that this work needs to be contextualized, that these women were not working in a vacuum, that they were looking at other artists, they were looking at art history, they were looking at the world around them. They were having their own lived experiences that were similar and different to the artists around them. And curators, it is our obligation, and historians and critics, to not only compare like with like, not only say, okay, here are two Black women abstract practitioners, let's compare them. Now, certainly Erin and I were asked that question when we were proposing the magnetic field show, even by the artists that we were talking to and invited, and we talked through this. Why was there not an exhibition that was about American abstraction that included everybody's contribution? And yes, that needs to happen. And I would love to work with any museum on the planet who would like to make that happen. Until we reach that point, we felt it was important, again, to kind of signal that there were these women who were doing this work, to use the platform that we had, the space that we had, the parameters that we had, to be able to say, hey, this might not be everyone, but here are a number of incredibly dedicated, incredibly prolific Black women working within this language, again, expanding, adapting, moving this language forward into new territory. And so the comparison amongst one another certainly needs to be made, but we also need to think about the work in relation to other abstract artists, right? So I think about Howardena Pindell and the sort of meditative, quiet, meticulous nature of her work. I can't imagine kind of adhering each of these teeny tiny little hole punch chads onto these large canvases. I mean, the kind of Zen transcendental space you mentally have to make that work is not dissimilar to the way Agnes Martin worked. So here are two paintings from the exact same year. You know, you walk into major museums across the country and there are rooms of Agnes Martin. Why can there not be rooms of Howardena Pindell? Or to hang them next to each other. We wax poetic about Mark Rothko and the depth of field, and I was able to spend some time in front of this magnificent Rothko at the Crystal Bridges Museum last year. But it occurred to me that the depth that Mary Lovelace is able to achieve by pushing this pigment into these canvases and going wet and dry and thick and thin and layering these beautiful marks on top of these swaths of space, and what that does to you physically, how you fall into her paintings, again, is not unlike a Mark Rothko. Certainly, I could make a million other comparisons. This is just one. I could have put a Franz Klein here. I could have put a Barnett Newman here. But something about the way Mary uses space just, you know, it is as brilliant as Mark Rothko. When I think about the way Betty Blayton thinks about nature and transcendentalism, certainly a case can be made to compare her work to that of Georgia O'Keeffe, or the way she lays these kind of aqueous layers of paint down to create these fields, right? This color field, which of course Helen Frankenthaler was, you know, she was a genius. She was an innovator, but the conversation can't stop at that. There are other artists who took that on and who moved it forward and who approached it in just as significant ways, right? Based on their own experiences in the world. When I think about the corporeal, the physical, the sensual way that Linda Banglis poured paint and made it a sculptural material, again, not unlike what Sylvia Snowden has and had been doing for decades. And I hope Sylvia will not be upset with me, but you can't help but think of expressionism, of neo-expressionism, German expressionism, the way the body is sort of described through paint, the way emotion raw emotion and sensuality and sexuality and human behavior can be described through paint is something that Sylvia just does so well. And, you know, I would hold her up to a George Baselitz any day. And of course, generationally, you know, Elaine De Kooning was older than Mildred Thompson, but at the same time, Mildred was a young artist and looking to someone like Elaine De Kooning and others around her and taking some of that language and learning about it and finding ways to manipulate it and finding ways to make it her own. So when I see Bullfight, which is, you know, an exemplary work by De Kooning, I think of a young Mildred Thompson, early in her 20s, new to New York City, and thinking about this relatively new visual language. I mean, really the height of abstraction was as Mildred was coming up. And so you see the similarities being borrowed isn't the right word, extrapolated on, experimented with. And Mildred Thompson, who met Louise Nevelson and was very inspired by her, began using wood pieces, wood segments, found wood, some that she was using as they were, and then certainly manipulating them as well. And so beautiful comparison between a Louise Nevelson and a Mildred Thompson. And so finally, just a couple more slides, just to say that there were moments, and there continue to be moments that are quite overwhelming, right? It requires resources of all kinds: human power, money, you know, museum space, gallery interest, writer, you know, scholars to be paying attention to this work. And, you know, there were certainly moments where when I began working on Mildred Thompson's estate in 2013 and seeing work that needed to be stored properly, needed to be archived, photographed, insured, you know, and not knowing how to do this. Artists lack the resources to get their work to where it needs to be. We got a small grant, but God, was it necessary, from the Judith Alexander Foundation that helped us photograph some of Mildred's work to make a website. You know, if there wasn't that, of course, this was 2013, then how could I get a Gallery Lalonde to see the work and pay attention to the work? And so this is a bit of a before and after. The piece on the right is from the Advancing Impulses series, and you can see that it was a damaged work. And in 2019, a highlight of my life was to see those works cleaned and restored and framed and lit and hung beautifully at Frieze Masters. And I'm happy to say that the painting on the left is now in a private collection. So that this is the goal, right? To look at ephemera that you find in a dusty attic or in a, you know, an old drawer, and be able to turn it into contextualized material to highlight the life of the artist in an exhibition. You find, you know, old photographs that, you know, maybe you don't have the originals, but you can find a way to blow them up and make a beautiful kind of wall vinyl to get the artist's presence, since Mildred is no longer here with us, to put her presence into the exhibition. There's Dr. Barnwell on the right. And finally, it's moments like these, right? It's discussion, it's platforms of visibility that need to be shared, it's conversations that need to be had. And I think this is probably the highlight of my career, to be sitting on stage with 4 of the most important curators working in America today: Dr. Andrea Barnwell, Hallie Ringel, Valerie Cassell-Oliver, and Lauren Haynes, and talking about all of this, talking about all of these women and their practice. And of course, this image is so sort of meta for me, because it is an image behind me of magnetic fields, where there are 6 artists representing 5 generations. 6, I'm counting Mildred's painting because she's not physically there, but Shanique Smith in her 40s, Deborah Dancy in her 50s, Condita Alvarez is all the way to the right in her 60s. Beneath her is E.J. Montgomery, who's in her 80s, and Lillian Burwell, who turned 90, who's now 93, who turned 90 at the opening of Magnetic Fields. So just, you know, I was in heaven in this moment. So I will end on this slide. Thank Arkansas Art Center again for this opportunity, and we'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, well, Melissa, thank you for this presentation and for sharing your research with us. I think we all now know a little bit more about these 5 women artists, and I really do hope everyone will look into them more and start to really investigate them.
I hope so too.
Yeah, I do have some questions that we've had sent in that I'd be happy for you to answer for us. At the beginning of your talk, you touched on this a little bit, but can you expand why you selected these 5 women artists to focus on?
Sure. So, you know, as a curator, as a researcher, there are always parameters, right? So even with Magnetic Fields, Erin and I could have probably included 50 artists in that show if we had expanded our thesis, right? But you have to think about how much space you have, how much time you have, how much money you have. So for something like Magnetic Fields, we really honed our research into artists who we felt were using kind of a non-representational language, sort of really privileging formalism as their expression, and had this as a dedicated pursuit over decades. Certainly there were other artists who we could have included who were, you know, early pioneers. I think of Lois Mailou Jones, I think of Samela Lewis, even someone like Vivian Brown. But so for like Samela, abstraction was a period of time in her practice. For Vivian Brown, the work for us was maybe connected to landscape in a little more of a literal way than, you know, so you have to think about the parameters of the exhibition and how to make a cohesive thesis and how to do justice to the artist that you're presenting, right? So to answer the question here, in pursuing this research project, it occurred to me, well, wait a second, you know, from Mildred to Howardena, that's 5 artists who were born within 6 years of each other. So it is truly a generation of women who were pursuing abstraction against all odds, facing criticism from their peers, from the, you know, being ignored by the broader art world, and yet for decades have continued this pursuit, right? And so it is, this is a little dramatic, it was like the lost generation, right? Like when you're looking at this period of history, when you're looking at Jack, I mean, I chose the male artists, Jack Whitten, Al Loving, Sam Gilliam, I could have put Frank Bowling, and you know, there are other artists. They were all born at the same time. They were all of the same generation, and yet more people know who Sam Gilliam is than they know who Mary Lovelace O'Neal is. So it was very much kind of trying to encapsulate a generation. And again, as I kind of said at the beginning of the talk, they were primarily painters. Certainly there were, I think I saw a comment on the Facebook post, you know, what about Beverly Buchanan? You know, she, in my mind, is more of a sculptor, primarily. Certainly Mildred Thompson made sculptures, you know, but the kind of primary to their practice was this mark making on a 2-dimensional surface, and certainly pushing that. Some people don't even think Howardena Pindell is a painter. They think of her as a collage artist or a sculptor in kind of more 2-dimensional terms. But so again, it was a way to try to put a parentheses and then an exclamation point around this notion that there are Black women abstract practitioners of this particular generation who you do not know. And again, the only reason you don't know them is racism and sexism, plain and simple.
The next question I have is that you have a personal connection with Mildred. She was your professor, she was your mentor. Can you talk a bit about what it is like to research and represent someone that you knew so well, and if that makes it more difficult?
Well, it makes it more difficult in that it becomes really emotional. I mean, I am constantly getting emotional about the ups and downs of working in her estate. It makes it easier in that when I'm needing to make decisions for the estate, I hear Mildred in my head. She was a very outspoken person, as are all of these artists. I will also add that. They know what they want, they say what they mean what they say. And so while I had Mildred in my life, I truly sat at her feet and absorbed as much as I could. And I wish I could have done that longer. But I feel like I am able to make decisions on her behalf, knowing what she would do. My question is always, what would Mildred Thompson do? And certainly I have the guidance of Donna Jackson, who was her partner for 18 years and the executor of the estate. But I will say too, that it makes it also impassioned. I mean, I'll say when I took this project on, it was pure volunteerism. Any moment, I was running a museum at the time. And so it wasn't like I had a lot of spare, I wasn't doing anything. So let's work on this. It was because Mildred meant everything to me and gave me so much. And I saw that this work was just phenomenal. And I couldn't understand why no one else couldn't see that. And they couldn't see it because things needed to be done to put it out there. And I knew that once they did, that all of the good things that are happening for Mildred's work would happen. It's so sorry, just I guess I didn't complete that thought. So it makes it possible to get through the hard times, to get through the, oh God, how are we going to conserve these paintings when we have no money? How am I going to get a gallery interested in this? All of the difficult moments were easier to get through because I had that personal connection. I think other curators might have given up. So there we go.
The next question that we had sent in, Sylvia Snowden, Mildred Thompson, they both attended Howard University.
As did Mary Lovelace O'Neal as well.
Can you discuss the importance of Howard and other universities for this group of artists?
I love that question. It's really an important one. I think we now take for granted the sort of pantheon of abstract expressionism, right? It's something we all sort of know on some even tertiary level. The average person knows who Jackson Pollock is, right? But when I try to imagine these young women in the late 50s, early 60s, studying art at school and being taught this language, being taught, I kind of always think about it like a language, right? Like the way Romance languages are all based in Latin. This is the way I think about abstract expressionism, right? Like there's a root, there were these tenets, there were these figures, mostly white and male, though there were women, and we're championing those white women too. I think they're finally, getting their due as being originators. But these young women who were studying art, and that was another outlet in which they were encouraged to explore, right? Mary Lovelace O'Neal spoke beautifully yesterday about her mentor, Dr. David Driscoll, who was a professor at Howard and then chaired the art department, who, encourage, hey, you look at this work and try this, and take a look at Franz Klein and see what he's about and see what that means for you. So the fact that these young artists were given this information that said, hey, this is what's going on in the art world and you should try this, you should kind of see how this feels for you. And also I think, during the course of their life, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the Black arts movement criticized many of these artists for kind of taking on this very kind of white male language, that it wasn't seen as what a Black artist should do, particularly a Black female artist should do. And so the fact that these universities were having these conversations, right, that were, and they were not, they were expansive. They were about, you know, thinking these things through and finding what works for you. And so I think we kind of can't underestimate the importance of something like Howard University in the development of not, and again, not only as abstract artists, but just as artists, right? That you young women can do this, you can take this on, and you can be a professional artist, you know? And so it was people like James Porter and Lois Mailou Jones and Dr. David Driscoll at Howard that really stewarded these young creative people and gave them that sort of foundation from which they grew and explored. And just a quick note, you know, Skowhegan as well. I think every single one of these artists of the five, if I'm remembering correctly, went to Skowhegan, and that was through Howard channeled like these scholarships. David Driscoll championed these scholarships so that these artists could go, and they saw themselves with other artists, white and otherwise, you know, and from different parts of the country. And so education really played a huge, huge role in their foundation and how they saw themselves as professional artists.
That question kind of leads into the next question that was sent in to us. So artists today, they really champion each other. They have a great support system. How do you think these women kind of worked together or supported each other, or did they support each other?
Yeah, I think, yes. I mean, supported each other, but also we're all fighting for scraps, right? Like fighting for attention, fighting for space. But I do think there was a championing. I mean, many of them, you know, showed together when they could, were friends with one another, or if not knew one another, traveled together in some cases. But I think certainly it's difficult to share when there's not enough to go around either, you know. So I think they were each as generous as they could be, but also were seeking opportunities for themselves as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's great. Yeah. Do you feel like your research on these five women is complete? And if so, what do you see your next project being?
Well, I will say, as I'm working on this, I'm working on other things as well as an independent curator, although my focus has mostly been female artists or artists who are marginalized, even for like geographic location. We didn't really even talk about that, but there's certainly discrimination against artists who are, you know, not sort of living in the market center, you know, so Southern artists and, you know, artists of color, artists who I've championed in my career. So this is not the only thing that I do. But the research is not over. It will never be over. I mean, there's so much work to do on each of these artists and then some. And I think also as long as these artists are continuing to make work, I mean, obviously there's still more to uncover about Mildred Thompson. I learned something new about her weekly. You know, Betty Blayton is an artist there are a few women who are working on their dissertation on her, Mildred as well, Howardena as well. But as long as, you know, Sylvia Snowden is in her studio painting every day, and she is, as long as, you know, Mary Lovelace O'Neal has new ideas to talk to me about, the work will never be done, you know. And also I have developed a relationship with these artists, both, you know, either their estates and their family or the artists themselves. And so it's not work anymore. It's like, I'm helping my family, you know, I'm helping my friends, you know. That's so yeah, no, it'll never be over. It's a life. I didn't know I was signing up for a lifelong position, but there it is.
Well, the final question that I have for you that's been sent in is really kind of going back to Magnetic Fields, that exhibition that you co-curated. Curious that you ended, kind of the cutoff point was an artist born 1981 or before that was featured in that exhibition. Looking back now and thinking about it, are there contemporary artists born after 81 that if you were redoing that exhibition that you would include?
I love this question. And I think about this a lot, like, could we do the show again? And could we expand it? Or could we find other parameters? And yes, I mean, shout out to all of the young women artists who are taking on abstraction, Black women artists who are taking on abstraction. And I hope that they have information about artists who were working before them in a way that maybe the older generation of artists in magnetic fields didn't necessarily have. Some of them did, don't get me wrong, but I think now we share information, you know, so fluidly, and you're able to access what people are doing, you know, in real time across the world in a way that certainly we've never had before. But yes, I mean, I would definitely include younger artists. I think of Caroline Kent working out of Chicago. I think of Carmen Neely working out of North Carolina. I think Raleigh. Krista Clark out of Atlanta. I mean, it's not even just, you know, New York anymore, right? There are artists from all over the country. And that was another thing we strive for in magnetic fields, that it wasn't just New York artists. But yes, I mean, the list could go on. Certainly there are artists that we didn't include in magnetic fields for you know, you have to make very hard decisions. So yes, if I had twice as much space, there are definitely artists that I would add. And again, I encourage everybody. This was such like the tip of the iceberg. The artists that I selected are the tip of the iceberg, and then I was only able to show a little bit of their work. So I hope everyone will kind of think about the fact that there are Black women working in abstraction and have been since the 60s and are doing it in such unique and distinct ways that I hope everyone will do a deeper dive intergenerationally. And I hope that the younger generation of artists are finding an easier time of it.
Well, we'll close our program out with that question. Again, thank you, Melissa, for sharing this information with us, your research with us. I really do hope that our patrons have learned about 5 women that they may not have known about before this program, and hope that they'll continue to watch their work and learn more about them.
Agreed. Thank you again so much for having me. And thank you to the audience that we can't see. In pre-COVID times, we get to see all of you and thank all of you for coming. But in these times where there's a lot of things to watch on your TV or computer, thank you for taking the time with us to learn about these artists. Thanks so much.